The battle for Earth had begun, and it was nothing like the Galactic Council had expected. The invasion should have been swift, a mere formality, with humanity falling to its knees within hours. But instead of submission, they faced resistance unlike anything recorded in the history of the galaxy. The humans refused to break. They refused to kneel. And now, the Council's forces were beginning to understand what they had unleashed. The initial strike had crippled Earth's defenses, or so the invaders believed. Their warships had shut down global communication networks, knocked out major military installations, and established control over orbital space. Thousands of dropships poured into Earth's cities, delivering heavily armored soldiers and war machines to enforce the Council's rule. Yet, something was wrong. By all calculations, humanity should have surrendered by now. Their armies should have collapsed. But the humans weren't fighting like a conventional military. They were fighting like a species that had survived extinction over and over again. On the ground, alien forces marched through ruined streets, searching for survivors to capture and enslave. The first few hours were easy. Humans fled, confused and disoriented, unable to contact their leaders. But then things changed. The soldiers began disappearing. Entire patrols were swallowed by the darkness of shattered cities, never seen again. Ambushes struck from nowhere, makeshift explosives, sniper fire from unseen locations, and hidden traps that turned the streets into killing grounds. The invaders were not facing a structured army. They were facing an entire species that had decided to fight to the death. In one occupied city, auxiliary commander led his troops through the ruins, scanning for human resistance. His species was among the strongest in the galaxy, towering reptilian warriors, bred for conquest. He had fought in over a dozen planetary campaigns, yet never had he seen an enemy behave like this. They weren't engaging in direct combat. They weren't forming lines or charging their forces. No, these humans were something else. They struck when least expected, vanished before retaliation, and used their own planet as a weapon. His forces marched through the remains of a human marketplace, scanning for signs of movement. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. His second in command, a heavily armored warlord from the Vornak species, growled in frustration. Cowards, he spat. They run and hide instead of fighting like warriors. The auxiliary commander was about to respond when a metallic click echoed in the silence. He barely had time to react before an explosion ripped through his forces. The humans had buried explosives under the debris, waiting for their enemies to step into the trap. Flames and smoke engulfed the street, and within seconds, human snipers opened fire from the rooftops, picking off alien soldiers before they could regroup. The commander roared orders, calling for backup, but their communication systems were being jammed. Another human trick. He had to retreat, had to regroup. But then he heard it. The sound of them. Humans emerging from the wreckage, wearing no advanced armor, wielding nothing but their own weapons, their own fury. They moved like ghosts through the battlefield, striking with precision and vanishing into the ruins. It was as if the city itself was fighting back. In orbit, the situation was growing worse. The Council's warships dominated the skies, their firepower unmatched. But something unexpected was happening. Human ships, far smaller and weaker in design, were proving to be a much greater problem than anticipated. They were fast, unpredictable, and somehow able to bypass the alien targeting systems. It was as if they knew exactly where the enemy's blind spots were. Aboard one of the Council's command ships, Admiral Sylph watched in frustration as yet another patrol cruiser went dark. His fleet was supposed to have full control of the battlefield, yet his forces were being hunted. He didn't understand it. The humans weren't supposed to have the capability to fight back in space. Yet his ships were being ambushed, one by an enemy that shouldn't even exist. One of his officers turned in alarm. "Admiral, we are detecting an unidentified human vessel approaching at high velocity." Sylph narrowed his eyes. No human ship should be capable of penetrating their blockade. Magnify. The view screen shifted, revealing a dark, angular warship unlike any human design previously recorded. It moved with unnatural speed, weaving through the wreckage of battle like a predator hunting its prey. Its weapons were silent, its systems unreadable. Then, in a single instant, it struck. The alien command ship trembled as a series of precision strikes disabled its shields. Zilf barely had time to react before half his systems went dark. Alarms blared. The unknown human vessel fired again, slicing through the ship's hull with devastating accuracy. It was as if the humans had spent years studying every weakness of their enemy. The human ship disappeared into the void before they could retaliate, leaving only destruction in its wake. Zilf clenched his claws. This was no ordinary resistance. Humanity was fighting back, and they were winning battles they had no right to win. On the ground, the war escalated. The Council's forces sent in reinforcements, determined to crush the resistance once and for all. But they were met with something far worse than expected: organized human militias, working together with remaining military forces, launching devastating counterattacks. The Council's forces had never faced an enemy like this before. Their enemies in the past had always submitted once their armies were destroyed. But the humans, they didn't stop fighting. Cities that had been declared under control by the Council were suddenly war zones once again. The invaders couldn't hold them. The humans struck fast, disappearing into underground tunnels, collapsing buildings onto advancing forces, using guerrilla tactics in ways that left the alien commanders speechless. In one region, a squad of elite alien warriors was ambushed by nothing more than human engineers. They used construction equipment as weapons, flooding tunnels, collapsing bridges, cutting off supply lines. The aliens had thought themselves unstoppable, only to find themselves cornered by beings who refused to die quietly. And then came the message. Across every communication channel the Council controlled, a human broadcast overrode their signals. A voice, calm and resolute, echoed across the battlefield. "You came to enslave us. You came to break us. But you have made a mistake. We are humanity, and we do not kneel." For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, fear spread through the ranks of the conquerors. Humanity was not surrendering. They were not retreating. They were hunting their invaders. And they were winning. The war was no longer a simple conquest. The Galactic Council had expected Earth to fall within hours, but now days had passed, and instead of surrender, humanity had only grown more dangerous. The invasion had turned into something far worse than the Council had ever faced: a war of attrition against a species that refused to submit. The alien forces had the advantage in firepower, technology, and numbers. But it no longer mattered. On the ground, humans fought with terrifying efficiency, striking and vanishing like ghosts. In space, their fleets, though weaker, were unpredictable, capable of exploiting weaknesses the Council had never considered. The alien High Command held emergency meetings aboard their massive warships in orbit. Holograms of their most powerful leaders flickered across the room, their expressions grim. Supreme Chancellor Voter, the very one who had pushed for Earth's enslavement, was no longer so confident. His reptilian features were twisted in frustration as he slammed a clawed fist onto the table. "This is unacceptable," he growled, his sharp teeth bared. "How is it possible that a single primitive world is resisting the might of the entire Council?" A bulky, armored warlord from the Vornak species let out a low growl. "They are weak, yet they fight like they have nothing to lose. Their attacks are precise. They adapt too quickly. It's unnatural." An insectoid diplomat clicked its mandibles. "It is as if they knew we were coming." Silence fell over the room. That was the fear none of them wanted to voice. The Council had planned this invasion for years. It was supposed to be a surprise, an overwhelming display of dominance. Yet the humans were fighting as if they had been preparing for this war their entire existence. In reality, they had. For centuries, humans had fought wars against their own kind. They had studied every form of combat, tested every kind of warfare. They had learned from their failures, from their history. Every major war had pushed them forward, refining their tactics, their ability to improvise, their will to survive. The Galactic Council had looked at their technology and assumed they were weak. But technology was only a tool. What made humanity dangerous wasn't their weapons. It was their ability to use anything as a weapon. On the ground, the resistance was growing stronger. The initial panic had disappeared, replaced with something far more terrifying to the invaders: determination. Cities that had been occupied were turning into death traps. Alien patrols were no longer safe. Every ruined building, every dark alley, every shattered street was a battlefield. In one occupied city, a group of alien soldiers marched through a deserted district, their weapons scanning for human survivors. Their commander, a battle-hardened officer from the Kiluri species, grumbled in frustration. "They should be broken by now," he muttered, his sharp, metallic-looking skin reflecting the dim light. The street was too quiet. He had learned, too late, that humans thrived in places like this. Before he could issue a warning, shadows moved. The attack came instantly. From the ruins above, a hail of gunfire rained down, targeting weak points in their armor. Explosions erupted from below, homemade bombs planted beneath the rubble. The aliens scattered, but the humans were already moving, darting between cover, striking with precision. It wasn't just random attacks. It was a strategy. The commander tried to call for reinforcements, but static filled his communicator. The humans were jamming their signals. Again. The battle lasted mere minutes. When it was over, the alien squad was wiped out. The humans stripped their weapons, took anything useful, and vanished before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Across the planet, similar attacks were happening everywhere. The Council's forces were used to direct battles, to fighting in controlled environments where their superior firepower ensured victory. But here, against humans, there was no control. The invaders weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an entire planet willing to die before surrendering. In the deep underground bunkers of Earth, human leaders watched the war unfold. Military generals, scientists, and strategists studied every move the aliens made, adjusting their tactics in real time. They didn't have the advantage of numbers or technology, but they had something the aliens lacked: experience in surviving the impossible. One of the commanders, an older general with years of battle scars, leaned over the strategy table. "They think they have the upper hand," he said, his voice calm. "Let's show them what they've really walked into." He pointed at the map. "We draw them deeper into the cities, force them to commit more troops, make them think they're winning." He looked up at the gathered officers. "And when they're stretched too thin," he smiled grimly, "we hit them where it hurts." And that was exactly what they did. As the days passed, the invaders found themselves walking into carefully planned traps. Massive supply convoys were ambushed. Key command centers were bombed. Alien officers were assassinated. Every time they tried to adapt, the humans were already 3 steps ahead. Then came the turning point. In orbit, the Council's fleets remained dominant, but something strange was happening. Their ships were disappearing, not being destroyed, not retreating, disappearing. Aboard the flagship of the invasion fleet, Admiral Sylph paced, his frustration growing. Every time he sent patrols to search for missing ships, they vanished too. It was impossible. No human vessel should be capable of taking out entire warships without leaving a trace. Then came the distress signal. A trembling voice filled the command deck. "This is Captain Verl of the Dreadnought Sovereign's Wrath. We are under attack. The humans, they have something." The transmission cut off. Zilth's blood ran cold. He turned to his officers. "Locate that ship immediately." But they couldn't. It was gone, just like the others. That was when Sylph realized something terrifying. Humanity wasn't just surviving. They weren't just resisting. They were hunting the invaders now, and the invaders had no idea how. On Earth, the resistance continued to grow. Military leaders who had once been hesitant now saw the truth. The aliens were not invincible. They could be hurt. They could lose. Across the planet, human forces united under a single purpose. Soldiers, civilians, hackers, scientists, even criminals. Every single human on Earth had become part of the war effort. Weapons were built in hidden factories, new strategies were tested, and stolen alien technology was turned against its creators. And in the depths of a secret military installation, a project that had been kept hidden for years was finally being activated. The lights flickered in a dark command room. Scientists watched as data streams poured across the screens. A single warship, unlike anything in the human fleet, came online. A scientist turned to a high-ranking officer, his voice filled with nervous excitement. "Sir, it's ready." The officer nodded, his gaze locked on the massive warship that had been waiting for this moment. "Then let's show them," he said, "what happens when you try to enslave Earth." And with that, humanity's greatest weapon was unleashed. The war was no longer about survival. Now it was about revenge. The Galactic Council's forces were beginning to crumble. The war that was supposed to be swift and decisive had turned into a nightmare where humans refused to break, refused to kneel, and worst of all, refused to fight like any enemy the Council had ever faced. Instead of being an easy conquest, Earth had become a graveyard for the invaders. Across the planet, alien war machines burned. Entire squads of elite soldiers had gone missing, never to be seen again. The towering warships that had once blacked out the sky were now being hunted, one, by an enemy that shouldn't have been able to stand against them. But humanity had never fought fair. The Council's fleets still held dominance in space, but it no longer mattered. They couldn't control the ground. They couldn't hold their territory. And now they were losing something even more critical than their forces. They were losing their fearlessness. For the first time in galactic history, an invading army, an army of dozens of alien species with technology centuries ahead of humanity, was afraid. The resistance was no longer scattered. It had evolved into an organized, unstoppable force. Cities that had once been occupied had turned into traps, bleeding the enemy dry. Every street was a battlefield, every building a potential ambush. And the worst part for the invaders, the humans weren't just defending anymore. They were going on the offensive. On the ground, Supreme Chancellor Voter watched the battlefield through the live holographic display inside his mobile command center. His claws twitched in frustration as red warning signals flared across the planetary map. His war machine, the unstoppable force that had enslaved dozens of worlds, was now being outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outthought by a species that should have been crushed weeks ago. "This is madness," Voter hissed, slamming his clawed fist on the control panel. "How can these primitives still be standing?" The alien general beside him, a war-hardened Vornak warrior, bowed his head. His armored plates were scorched, evidence of close combat with human forces. "Chancellor, our forces are stretched too thin. The humans strike from the shadows, hitting our supply lines, cutting off reinforcements, disabling our communication networks. Every time we believe we have control, they strike again." Voter's reptilian eyes flared with rage. "Then burn them, eradicate their cities, wipe them out." The general hesitated. "We tried, Supreme Chancellor, but they are using their own cities against us. Every building we level, they turn into a trap. Every road we claim, they mine with explosives. Every inch of this planet is becoming our enemy." Then came the next report, one that made Voter's blood run cold. The human fleet, the one the Council had believed too weak to challenge them, was launching a counterattack. In orbit, the war had changed. The Council's ships still outnumbered the humans, but something was different. The enemy was no longer fighting like a desperate dying force. They were fighting like predators. Admiral Sylph, commander of the invasion fleet, stood rigid on his command deck, watching in horror as yet another Council dreadnought exploded into flames. Not from an enemy fleet, not from an obvious attack, but from something they couldn't even detect. "They're here again," his tactical officer whispered. Sylph's claws gripped the control panel. He didn't need to ask who. The Phantom ship. It had been plaguing his fleet for days now. A single, unknown human vessel, one that defied all logic. It didn't show up on sensors. It moved faster than any warship should. And worst of all, it could strike without warning, and then vanish before they could retaliate. "Find them," Sylph growled. But deep down, he knew they couldn't. And then, as if mocking him, it happened again. A ripple in space, a shadow against the darkness. And then, the dreadnought beside them exploded, torn apart in a surgical strike. The human warship faded into view for just a moment, sleek and terrifying. It was unlike anything Sylph had ever seen, a vessel that shouldn't exist, that defied every known law of warfare. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Sylph's breathing was heavy. "We need to regroup." But before his officers could respond, a new signal came through, one that sent fear through every ship in the fleet. A transmission. From the humans. A calm voice, filled with quiet, unwavering confidence, echoed through the communication systems of every Council warship. "You thought we were weak. You thought we would kneel. You were wrong. You came here to enslave us. Now you will pay the price. This is our world, and you are not welcome here." And with that, the human counterattack began. On the surface, the resistance struck with unprecedented force. For the first time since the war began, humanity was taking back its cities. Coordinated attacks erupted across every occupied zone. Soldiers and civilians alike rose up, moving with terrifying precision. Alien command centers were destroyed. Reinforcement ships were shot down before they could land. The Council's forces, once so confident, were now on the defensive. In one battlefield, a group of human soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, stood against an elite squad of Silari warriors. The aliens, massive and covered in thick natural armor, should have crushed them. But the humans didn't fight fair. They used the ruins to their advantage, setting traps, using hit-and-run tactics, taking the fight into close quarters where the alien size became a weakness. The battle lasted only minutes. When it was over, the humans remained standing. And the aliens. Not a single one had survived. The war was no longer about survival. It was about vengeance. The Galactic Council had thought they could conquer Earth without consequence. They had made a fatal mistake. Now, the resistance was rising. Now, the Council's fleets were losing control. And now, the most terrifying truth of all was becoming clear. Humanity was winning. On the surface, the war had shifted into something far worse for the invaders. They were no longer an occupying force. They were prey. Cities that had been under their control had fallen silent, not because the humans had surrendered, but because they were waiting, watching, stalking their next target. The invaders couldn't move without fear. Their convoys were ambushed. Their supplies were cut off. Their bases were bombed with terrifying precision, and when they tried to retaliate, the humans were already gone. The resistance had grown into a full-scale counteroffensive. The war that the Council had started had mutated into something far worse, a war that humans were fighting on their terms. In a hidden command bunker beneath what had once been New York, General Elias Carter watched as new reports came in. Every screen flickered with battlefield data, showing the impossible. Red markers, representing enemy forces, were vanishing, one after another. Alien strongholds were falling. Key commanders were being assassinated. Entire battalions were being wiped out overnight. Carter exhaled slowly. "They're breaking." Beside him, Major Lou nodded grimly. "They're not used to fighting an enemy like us. They thought their numbers and firepower would be enough." She glanced at the holomat. They were wrong. Carter leaned forward. "Tell me about our ghost ship." Lou smirked. "She's been busy." The Phantom warship had become a legend among the enemy. A single, unknown human vessel, undetectable by conventional sensors, capable of striking without warning and vanishing without a trace. The Council's fleets were still larger, still more advanced. But they were no longer safe. Aboard the flagship Dominator, Admiral Xilth stared at the wreckage drifting in space, the remains of yet another warship that had been destroyed without a single warning. His forces were crumbling. He had lost contact with 2 more fleets. His reinforcements were being intercepted before they could even reach Earth. And worst of all, they still couldn't track the Phantom. His second-in-command, a pale-skinned Draken officer, spoke in a low, trembling voice. "Sir, we've run every scan, every energy signature comparison. We can't find it. It's like it doesn't exist." Xilth clenched his claws. "Then explain why it's destroying my ships." A sudden alarm rang through the command deck. The crew scrambled as a new alert appeared on the screen. A transmission. From the humans. Again. This time, there was no voice. Just 3 words. "Run while you can." Xilth felt something he had never felt before in his long military career. Dread. On the ground, the situation was worse. The alien soldiers, once so sure of their victory, were now desperate to escape. A squad of Kilari warriors, one of the elite units of the invasion force, moved through the ruins of a once thriving city. Their weapons were raised, their eyes scanning every shadow. They had been sent to hunt down a small human resistance cell. Now, they were the ones being hunted. A sudden explosion ripped through the alleyway behind them. Fire and smoke filled the air. The squad leader turned, his heart pounding. "Move. We have to." A gunshot rang out. He fell, a clean bullet wound through his skull. The rest of the squad barely had time to react before the human struck. From the rooftops, from the windows, from the shadows. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. When it was over, the only sounds left were the distant echoes of the city. The humans were already gone. The Supreme Chancellor of the Council, Voter, had seen enough. Seated in his heavily guarded command center aboard the massive dreadnought Judgment, he watched in growing horror as new reports came in. The invasion was failing. No, it had already failed. His forces were being wiped out. The human fleet was no longer running. It was hunting. Their soldiers were fighting like they had nothing to lose. And now the humans were pushing into space. His advisors trembled. The once arrogant council general spoke in hushed, fearful tones. This was no longer a war they could win. "We should retreat," one of them whispered. Voter's claws dug into the armrest of his chair. No. He refused to accept it. He had led the charge for Earth's enslavement. He had promised the Council that humanity would be broken. To retreat now would be to admit failure. He would rather burn Earth to ashes than let it stand victorious. But then, the humans made the decision for him. Because the next transmission that appeared on his screen was not from his own fleet. It was from humanity. The figure that appeared was not an alien warlord, not a diplomat. It was a human woman, dressed in a military uniform, ice cold, expression unreadable. "Supreme Chancellor Voter," she said calmly, "your fleet is falling. Your forces on the ground have been wiped out." Voter bared his teeth. "You dare." She cut him off. "You invaded our world," she continued. "You burned our cities. You killed our people." She leaned forward, eyes sharp as steel. "Now we give you one chance. Leave." Silence filled the room. Voter snarled. "You think you can threaten me?" The human only smiled. And then the screen shifted to a live feed of space. His heart stopped. It showed his own fleet, and surrounding it was an entire human armée. Ships that shouldn't exist. Ships that had no business standing against the might of the Galactic Council. And yet there they were, blocking every possible escape route, weapons locked, engines burning with cold fury. A fleet of ghosts. Voder's breath hitched. Impossible. The human woman's voice was calm. You have 5 minutes to decide. The screen went black. And for the first time in his life, Supreme Chancellor Voder had no idea what to do. Because for the first time, he understood the terrible truth. They had never been fighting to enslave Earth. They had been fighting for their own survival. And now, humanity was taking the fight to them. You said the war was over. At least it should have been. The Galactic Council's forces were shattered. Their fleets, once thought invincible, had been hunted down, one by one. Their armies on the ground were no longer conquerors. They were prisoners, deserters, or corpses. Humanity had not only survived, it had won. But Earth was no longer fighting for survival. Now it was fighting for justice, and justice required retribution. In orbit, Supreme Chancellor Voder stood frozen, his scaled hands gripping the edges of his command console. The dreadnought Judgment, once the symbol of his rule, now drifted in space, completely surrounded. Human warships filled every screen. They had come from nowhere. The Council had believed humanity's fleet to be weak, barely capable of leaving their own solar system. But now, that weak fleet had somehow pushed the most powerful armada in the galaxy to the brink of destruction. And worse, they weren't showing mercy. Supreme Chancellor, his lead tactical officer, stammered, We need orders." Voder could hear the panic in the officer's voice. Every escape route was blocked. Every fleet under his command had either fallen or abandoned him. The humans were waiting, watching, letting him feel the terror they had felt when the Council had come to enslave their world. Then the comms activated. The same human woman appeared on screen, standing tall in her military uniform, unshaken, unafraid. She spoke, her voice as sharp as a blade. You had your chance. Then the transmission cut out, and the bombardment began. The first human attack came from the flanks. Precision strikes. Surgical. Devastating. The Judgment shook as explosions tore through its outer hull. Fire erupted across the bridge as alarms screamed in every language known to the galaxy. Shields failing. A crew member shouted. Redirect power. Voder roared. Fire back. But there was nothing to fire at. The human fleet moved like phantoms. Every time the Judgment locked onto a target, it would already be gone, appearing in another sector to strike again. It was like trying to fight ghosts. More dreadnoughts in the fleet were torn apart. Another explosion rocked the ship. A blast door sealed shut as the fires spread. The comms crackled. One of his last remaining admirals was screaming. They're inside. Voder's blood ran cold. The battle wasn't just outside. The humans had boarded them. Inside the corridors of the Judgment, chaos erupted. Elite human strike teams moved like shadows, cutting through alien soldiers with ruthless precision. A squad of Council troops, trained from birth to fight, equipped with the best weapons in the galaxy, set up a defensive position in one of the main corridors. They were ready. They had the advantage. Or so they thought. A single, deafening explosion blew the reinforced doors open. And then the humans came. They didn't storm in recklessly. They moved with cold, terrifying efficiency. The first shots were clean, precise headshots that took out key officers instantly. The remaining soldiers barely had time to react before the humans were among them. Close quarters combat. Brutal. Efficient. Knives flashed. Bones broke. Alien warriors that had never known fear were slaughtered. The battle lasted only 30 seconds. And then, silence. The last human soldier wiped his blade clean, then signaled the rest of the strike teams. The message was clear. The ship is ours. Voder could barely comprehend what was happening. One moment, he had been on the verge of crushing Earth. The next, his empire was collapsing around him. The main bridge doors burst open. Human soldiers entered, their weapons raised, but they did not fire. They didn't need to. Voter knew it was over. And then the human commander stepped forward. She didn't gloat. She didn't mock him. She simply said, "Kneel." Voter bared his teeth. He was Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Council. He would never. A single gunshot rang out. A sharp burning pain tore through his knee. He collapsed, his body betraying him as he hit the floor. The human commander stared down at him, her face unreadable. "You enslaved worlds," she said. "You butchered entire civilizations." She took a step closer. "You thought humanity would be easy." Another step. "You thought we would kneel." She crouched beside him, her voice low. "Now look at you." Voter trembled. For the first time in his life, he understood what true fear felt like. The commander stood. "The council's reign is over." She turned to her soldiers. "Burn it." And with that, the final bombardment began. From the surface of Earth, millions watched as the once great flagship of the Galactic Council was torn apart. A symbol of their enslavement, reduced to nothing. The final remnants of the invasion force fell within hours. Across the galaxy, species that had once feared the Council now saw a new power rising. Humanity. And humanity did not forget. The war was over. But the real fight was just beginning. The galaxy had changed forever. The war for Earth had ended, not with humanity's enslavement, but with the total collapse of the Galactic Council. Their fleets had been annihilated. Their leaders had been executed or captured. Their once mighty empire, which had stood for centuries, had crumbled within months. And the species that had once voted to enslave Earth. Now, they begged for mercy. On Earth, the celebrations had lasted for days. The sky over New York was filled with fireworks, the streets flooded with people cheering, embracing, and crying. They had survived. They had won. But General Elias Carter stood in the shadows of a high-rise balcony, watching the celebrations below with a solemn expression. The war was over, but what came next? That was an entirely different battle. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You should be down there with them." Carter turned to see Major Lou approaching, 2 glasses of whiskey in her hands. She offered one to him, and he took it with a nod. "I will," he said, "but not yet." Lou leaned against the railing. "You're thinking about what happens next." Carter took a slow sip. "We didn't just beat the Council. We destroyed them." He glanced at her. "And now someone has to take their place." Lou smirked. "I think we both know who that's going to be." They clinked glasses. In the heart of the galaxy, the last remnants of the Galactic Council stood before their new rulers. The council chamber, once a grand hall filled with powerful alien leaders, was now a place of judgment. The few remaining senators, those who had survived humanity's wrath, knelt before the human delegation. They had ruled over thousands of worlds. They had enslaved entire species. Now, they knelt like criminals awaiting their sentence. The same human commander who had brought the council to its knees, Commander Evelyn Graves, stood before them. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of an entire planet's vengeance. "You voted to enslave us," she said. "You thought humanity was weak. You thought we would kneel." Her gaze swept across the trembling senators. "You were wrong." She raised her hand. A holographic map of the galaxy appeared. Countless worlds once under the Council's rule were now free. Their chains broken. Their former masters now hunted, exiled, or dead. "This is the new reality," Graves continued. "The old order is gone. The Galactic Council is finished." One of the alien senators, a wrinkled Exetheri diplomat, raised his trembling hands. Please. Have mercy." Graves tilted her head. "Mercy?" She stepped forward, her boots echoing in the silent chamber. "Did you show mercy when you sent your fleets to burn our cities?" The Exetheri swallowed hard, his mandibles clicking nervously. Graves didn't blink. "Did you show mercy when you slaughtered our people? When you kidnapped our children? When you turned our world into a battlefield?" Silence. Graves exhaled slowly. No, you didn't. She turned away. You will spend the rest of your lives in exile. No power, no armies, no fleets. The galaxy you once ruled now belongs to those you oppressed. The senators sagged in relief. Exile was better than death. But Graves wasn't done. She turned back, her eyes like steel. But make no mistake, she said. Humanity will never forget. She leaned forward. And if any of you, even one of you, dares to rise again, her voice dropped to a whisper, we will finish what we started. The new era had begun. Humanity, once a species struggling for survival, now stood at the center of galactic politics. They had been cast as victims, but in the end, they had become something far greater. The rulers of the stars. And for the first time in history, the galaxy understood one simple truth. You do not break humanity. Humanity breaks you.